Welcome to the Blue Cottage tonight for our live author event. We're so happy that you are with us. We are excited to host the second show of our 2022-2023 season. My name is Krista Sukup, and I am looking forward to introducing you to this evening's authors. Jim Jones is coming to us live from his home in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. He is an award-winning singer, songwriter, and author of 5 novels set in northern New Mexico in the late 1800s. His songs I can't see. I better put on my cheaters. Sorry about that, folks. All right. His songs and books are about the West, cowboys, horses and cattle rustlers, and the coming of the train. Songs about people and land, rivers, mountains, and the beauty of the Western sky. Jim has produced 12 Western folk albums. His many awards include Western Music Association's Male Performer of the Year, International Western Music Association Song of the Year, and other awards from Western Writers of America and the Western Heritage Wrangler Award. He will be discussing his newest novel, Halo Moon, published by 5 Star. RG Yoho, we're going to call him Bob. He goes by Bob. He's coming to us live from Ohio tonight. He's the author of The 9 Lives of Charles E. Lively, the deadliest man in the West Virginian Colorado coal mine wars. He's a West Virginia native with a passion for history and tales of the American West. He's a Spur Award finalist. He's the author of the 5-book Kellen Malone Western series, as well as a book of historical fiction and nonfiction. His varied career includes speaker, radio talk show host, and political columnist, as well as laboratory technician and process operator in the chemicals industry. Tonight, he'll be discussing his most recent biography, The 9 Lives of Charles E. Lively, the deadliest man in the West Virginia Colorado coal mine wars. He's a proud member of Western Writers of America and resides near the banks of the Ohio River with his wife of 40 years. And we do invite you to submit your comments and questions in the chat tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Jim Jones, and he is going to be talking to Bob about his book. Take it away.
Well, all right. Thank you, Krista. Thanks to Blue Cottage Agency for hosting these things. We sure enjoyed the first one with Mark Jackson and Ashley Sweeney, and we hope we can carry that torch. One of the things, it's a pleasure to visit with my friend Bob Yoho. We've known each other for years, but we hadn't had a chance to do something like this formally. I think we've probably talked about books informally many times at the Western Writers of America conference. But one of the things that I think to me makes this a really interesting night is that my book is a work of fiction, historical fiction, and Bob's work is historical nonfiction. And I will tell you, my bias in the past has been I'd rather watch paint dry than read nonfiction, because the people that write it tend to make it so boring. I got cured of that when I read Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides, and I wrote Empire of the Summer Moon, Sam Gwynn. Bob Yoho is right up there with those guys. He manages to tell the story in such a compelling way. And so that may be one of the things that we touch on. What I want to start with, you mentioned this in the title when you read it, Krista. It's the West Virginia Colorado coal mining wars. It seems to me that that's not something that you hear a lot about in history. I mean, I think, and yet when you read this book, and if you do look into the history, it had profound impact on our country, including the development of labor unions and things, as I understand it. So what I'm curious about, Bob, I hadn't got to the question yet, but this is it. I'm curious about your connections to this whole topic of coal mining wars, the development of the unions, and what was it that compelled you to write this story?
Well, there isn't any short answer to that question.
Well, that's a heck of a long question, so.
And thanks for having us on here, Chris. I appreciate it. This should be fun. I appreciate it. I think kind of, as anybody born in West Virginia, I kind of think coal's kind of in your DNA. I mean, it's been a part of the state for so long. It's part of its heritage, part of its tradition. My interest in this really started with a film by John Sayles called Matewan. Yeah. And Matewan didn't really tell the story of Charles E. Lively that well, because he was portrayed incorrectly in that story somewhat. I mean, he wasn't there the day of the actual Matewan shootout, but I got interested in that. And actually, you blame Kevin Costner for some of this. He did a History Channel miniseries on the Hatfields and McCoys. And I thought it was interesting as it was. I thought it still wasn't the most interesting history in West Virginia. And that involved Charles E. Lively and the shootout at Matewan, which led to assassination on the courthouse steps, which led to the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the largest armed insurrection since the Civil War. So, and I really wanted to write that. And I thought maybe if they ever come back and visit that, possibly if somebody has written about that, they will do it again. I had written a historical fiction work about Charles Lively, a book called Return to Matewan. But the more I learned about him and the more I'd studied about him, he was just too good a story. The truth was better than the fiction.
Wow. Well, that's cool. So it sounds like some of your connection is because of being from West Virginia, and that's such a part of the fabric of the history of that state. And it's interesting, the connection between West Virginia and Colorado too. With the coal mining industry, that similar things were happening both places. So my next topic, I guess, because they go way beyond questions, I think. So part of my checkered past is that for many years I was a psychotherapist, and so I have an interest in trying to understand people's motivation and kind of why they do what they do. I mean, if I had to choose just one word to describe Charles Lively, I would have to say fanatic. I mean, he was fanatical in what he did, working for the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, and he would go undercover for long periods of time and impersonate a miner or have a connection with the miners, and was kind of working on the inside undercover. One of the descriptions in your book, someone did describe him as a sociopath, but to me, a sociopath is only connected to themselves, only cares about themselves. Charles Lively seemed to care about the people in the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. He was extremely loyal to them. There wasn't a great deal of personal gain that he got from this whole thing of what he did. But at the same time, it's even though he was amongst the miners and they often considered him one of them, he seemed to have almost no sympathy or empathy for them. So what I wound up feeling after I read the whole book was, I sure don't understand this guy. So I'm hoping you can just explain him to me, help me understand kind of his makeup, that he did, why he did what he did.
Well, I think the best way to maybe somewhat understand man, and I don't know you can fully do it. I think sometimes psychopath is maybe not even, as you said, not even fully a perfect explanation of him. This is a guy that had pictures of Thomas Felts and William Baldwin on his mantle, which tells you usually put the people that are closest to you that you love and respect up there. And he had pictures of them. So that tells you he cared about them a great deal. But I would think you would have to go to some writings of his son, who was named Charles Albert. He wrote to a man named W.C. Blizzard, who was the son of Bill Blizzard, who was the boy general that led the forces of Blair Mountain. Well, the letter he wrote to him, he talked about his dad in that. And to know all this, when the unions were really getting started here big time in the coal industries, in the coal industry here in America and others, Thomas Felts quite often called the striking miners, he called them Bolsheviks. And Charles Albert, who was Charles E. Lively's son, wrote to William W.C. Blizzard. He said his dad called these miners that he turned in, he called them Reds. So he said if anything happens to him, that's just one less red to deal with. So perhaps in his own way, he thought he was fighting communism. But ultimately, I think it's like trying to understand maybe a serial killer or something like that, which he may have been one of those as well. But I think sometimes if you can fully understand these people, you probably aren't somebody we really want to be around. Yeah, it's that simple and that difficult.
Well, it makes me glad that I said I didn't understand him. So, so nobody's gonna think I'm a serial killer. Yeah, just a fascinating character study, and I think you're probably right. I think you can study all the information that there is available, and some of it seems contradictory even. And it's not that some of it's true and some of it's not. It's just he was a complex individual, but he was fanatical in his dedication to Baldwin Felts. And so that makes me think of another thing. And I see a lot of parallels in what was going on then and some of the things that I see going on in our country now and the world now. But something that seems to be kind of different is the power of those private detective agencies like Baldwin Felts. I assume that was sort of similar to like a Pinkerton agency or something like that. Where did they get their authority? I mean, how did that all work? That those guys are out basically deciding the fates of all these individuals and these big conflicts and things, and we didn't elect them or anything. I mean, tell me about that.
I think they just, as you mentioned about Pinkertons, William Baldwin and Alan Pinkerton were actually friends and contemporaries and knew each other. And I think of course, about what the Pinkertons did at Jesse James's home. They set off an explosion at Jesse James's house, killed Jesse's younger brother, and I think his mother lost her arm from that event. And so Pinkertons and Baldwin Felts as well, I think they just essentially were almost like the regulators you talk about back in the days of Billy the Kid out in New Mexico territory. I think they just pinned badges on themselves. The wealthy political elites and the wealthy in town hired them, and they had badges, and it was just, I think they just took on the authority on themselves, and nobody had the power to really stop them. I think it was just more they started up, they saw a need there, or what they can perceive to be a need, and they stepped in and filled it. And I don't think they grew so rich and powerful. I think that the law just assumed they were law, and they wore badges. So I think people just sort of assumed they were the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It did seem to me from reading this book that a lot of the Baldwin Felts authority came from the coal company owners, the big corporations, or big entrepreneurs, wealthy entrepreneurs that own those companies. But it does also, I mean, it does seem like that the boundaries kind of got a little bit blurred there. Another thing related to all this, though, in Western fiction, particularly traditional Westerns, the lawman is always a good guy. He gets the girl at the end and all that stuff and sings to his horse. But there were law enforcement officers involved in this whole thing that were obviously in the pocket of the coal companies. I mean, they were almost like, well, I mean, I think informally they were employees because they were making probably more money than their salary from coal companies. So they didn't seem to be good guys to be. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's exactly right. I have a friend that's a member of the West Virginia State Police, and the West Virginia State Police, they essentially started as basically an enforcement arm of the coal companies. And I mean, I think it quite possibly one of the few state polices in this country that was started for probably bad, nefarious purposes. And the day that Charles E. Lively on August 1st, 1920 shot Ed Chambers and Sid Hatfield on the courthouse steps, there were a lot of lawmen along with state policemen there. And I think almost every lawman that was there that day, along with the Baldwin Felts agents, I think were in it. And I think they were there to provide alibis and help help Charles E. Lively get off in court. And
Mhm.
and I think there wasn't one lawman there that was honest, and quite possibly the guy that went there was Sid Hatfield that day. He may have been involved in it too. If not, he may have dropped the gun there, that Sid's gun there.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. And, it makes me think, I mean, so it does sound like a lot of this was sort of orchestrated to kill Hatfield in particular. And I'm guessing that there would be other places, other towns or whatever, where they absolutely wouldn't do it because I think maybe the law
Yeah.
enforcement people would be exactly the opposite extreme, where they would be absolutely supportive of the miners and not the coal companies. But that's interesting. Another thing that struck me, and I said there were some things about all this that to me seem like sort of parallel to what I see happening these days, and I'm not trying to get, well, I guess I'm getting political in the sense that all of this was pretty political at the time, but I don't want to get partisan at all. But what it occurs to me is that much like what I perceive today, the media, and at that time the media was newspapers. I mean, there wasn't much other kind of media. But the newspapers were so divided on this that if you read the New York Times, you'd get a very different picture of all the events that happened, as opposed to maybe a paper in Colorado, for example. I'm just kind of making that part up. But I mean, I got that impression that. So, what was that all about? The different perceptions? Because how would a person find out the truth?
I don't know that they could. I honestly, you sit down there, and as you said, there'd be maybe two newspapers in the same town, and one of them was largely a Democrat paper, one of them was a Republican paper, and the New York Times. I don't have much good to say about them either, because they kind of made light of the fact that Lively killed Hatfield, but they were the newspaper that stirred up much of the trouble involving the Hatfields and McCoys several years ahead of that. So the media were part and parcel of this whole thing, and maybe made it worse, but they didn't seem greatly interested in reporting the probably a lot of times the stories of the people that were suffering out there trying to get a union.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes me and this last topic I want to bring up, and I really want to hear what you have to say about this, because again, my knowledge of this history is pretty minimal, but I know a little bit about it, and I think these kinds of conflicts and the violence and the clashing and the oppression that happened and all that stuff were what eventually resulted in the unionization of not just coal mines, but then it got much broader with auto workers and all that stuff as the years went by. But so what do you see as the connection from then to the development of the unions?
Well, I kind of have a unique perspective on some of this, because I worked in all 39 years in chemical plants. I've been non-union, and I actually organized a union at one point and led a successful union effort, which could have gotten me fired in the state of Ohio. So I know a little bit about maybe even the fear and the fear a family might have about losing their home over something, or losing their job. And so I know a little bit about it, but I tend to believe capitalism is a great system, but and perhaps the best it was ever conceived. But I think it fails without some kind of moral component. And it seems like those that have it succeeds well. I can cite one name in particular, a man named Milton Hershey of the Hershey bars. Milton Hershey was a wealthy businessman, employed a lot of people making Hershey up in Pennsylvania, and he took great care of his workers and just did all kinds of things for them. And the union wasn't so much necessary up there with them. And so it's a difference. And I've had bosses that I believe over that 39 years that honestly, you could have put them back 100 years and they put them in charge of a coal company. They've been right at home. And I've had other bosses that would be right there, do anything for you. So, human nature is just such that some men are bad, and if they're given enough power, they'll misuse it. And there are good people out there too that given power, they won't abuse it. It's just part of the human condition, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I got a couple more things that I wanted to ask you about. This is a comment, but also a question. As I was reading the book, and this was probably in the first third of the book, and I already gave away my bias against nonfiction that was pretty long standing. There was a passage, and it goes on for a couple of pages, so I don't want to take the time to read it. But it was, I mean, the language that you used was really descriptive and colorful and gripping, and yet everything you were saying was factual, and it was related to the factual historical story that you were telling. But you wrote it incredibly well, I thought. And so my question is, because I know you have a background writing fiction as well, so did that affect the way you wrote? Not, I don't mean in terms of playing loose with the facts, but I mean just in terms of the language that you used in that sort of thing.
I had 2 or 3 goals when I did this book. You can't talk to me 5 minutes and start confusing me with an academic. I'm just you just don't make that mistake. I'm too raised on a farm. I'm a big hick, but I wanted to write a book that would appeal to academics and scholarly. And at the same time, I didn't want to read like those books, and I probably have the same bias, Jim. I wanted this book to read somewhat. I wanted to be absolutely true to the facts, but I wanted it to not be dry as dirt. And that's really what I set out to do with this book. And I hoped I accomplished it. And I think probably I did. But I think there's something to be said for maybe a novice being able to possibly tell a story better than possibly an academic who may operate from that Jack Webb, just the facts mentality,
And the 3 academics that were watching us now have logged off, I'm sure. No.
Yeah, it's hard to say that without maybe upsetting someone. I've known academics that wrote brilliant books. I read a book about the camel crusade out west, and it was written. It was a history book, but the guy had done a brilliant job of writing it. It was almost as a novel, and I really enjoyed that. And that was actually kind of what I had in mind when I started to write this book.
Well, I think you nailed it. Here's my last question, and I'll start with one of my favorite quotes of all time is the Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana, who's the guy credited with saying, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So my question for you is, what are the takeaways? What do we need to learn from all this and remember going forward?
Well, the first thing I said about somebody asked me about that one time, and I said, well, this book is about Charles Lively. This is Charles. Don't be like Charles. And that's probably the first lesson you probably should get from it. But as far as the takeaways, you can see what absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it seems like these people had it. They had the government. They had Baldwin Felts Detectives Agency on their side. They had the media behind them, and that's hard not to abuse that. And I think we need to remember that lesson, possibly not go back to that time. But these people were, no matter how you feel about capitalism or whatever, these people were fighting for their lives and their livelihoods. And at that time, the coal companies, they didn't care how many they killed. They'd just go get more. And it didn't matter to them. But people work hard. I've been a blue collar guy all my life, pretty much. I grew up on a farm and I worked in a chemical plant. I've learned that dirty hands make clean money. And I think it's just, it's important to remember that just doing to others, you have them doing to you. I think that works well in capitalism. It works well in business. It works well in everything. And that's probably, Charles Lively didn't worry about anybody else other than himself. And I think that's a good lesson to be learned from this.
Thank you. That was great. That's kind of what I got, Chris. I don't know if you have questions from chat room or anything, or
Yeah, that was thank you, Bob. That was really interesting. It's just fascinating to dig deeper into some of those stories that we hear. And I too can attest that your fiction writing, transitioning into writing this nonfiction book, it really makes a compelling story. I'm going to turn it over to Bob. And I know you read Halo Moon, and I'm excited to hear what your thoughts are about Jim's latest novel. And I'll let you take it away to Jim.
Well, I read this book, Halo Moon. It's not the first Jim Jones book I read. I read one of his other books, and I think The Lights of Cimarrón, I believe, was one of them. But Jim is an excellent writer, and this book is a darn good story, a darn good traditional Western. Probably the first thing I wanted to ask Jim about it, and I was going to put a review on it, but I didn't want to put a review out until we'd done this broadcast. I didn't want to take anything away from it. But Jim, the question I got, Halo Moon is a particularly bloody and violent story with knife killings and such. How difficult was that to write? I mean, you're a man that pens songs such as Good Days Are Coming Soon. And how do you write that?
Well, I guess I better tell you that it doesn't come easy, it's not. Well, a couple of things about that. I have an older lady who has read my books, and when I think it may have been The Lights of Cimarrón was the last one she read, which was the one that I wrote before this, and it had actually some of the same characters, and she was just said she could only read a little bit and she had to put it down because the bad guy was so bad. Well, as it turns out, a lot of the characters that are the bad guys in my books are composites of historical figures, and a lot of the violent stuff that they do are things that some of those historical figures did. And the bad guy in Halo Moon, the baddest guy, because there are several bad guys in that thing, but the baddest of the bad, the really evil one, is based on a character in northern New Mexico who did stuff like that. So that's a big part of it is that I guess there's the part that I have a dark side that nobody knows about, but no, but and the other thing, and like you, I mean, I think a lot of what makes stories about anything, but I mean stories about the West, to me, what makes it most compelling is the conflict between good and evil, and you showed it brilliantly in your book of nonfiction that's never simple. It's always complex. Nobody's always the good guy, and most people are not always the bad guy. And every so often there are people who are that bad, and so to have that kind of conflict and tension, I want to make sure my bad guys are pretty darn bad.
I'll tell you what, your bad guy in that book pretty well lived up to the guy in my book. I mean, being pretty bad. There's obviously, as you read this book, and I notice there's obviously a huge disagreement in how the two main characters think, as there is for most men and women. But will the relationship between Jared Delaney and Eleanor be resolved in your next book?
Okay, just to set up the question, Jared Delaney is the protagonist of the Moon series, and this is the fourth book in the Moon series. And his wife is Eleanor, and so what happens in this book basically is Jared, a man who was basically a father figure to both of them, to both Jared and to Eleanor, is murdered in the previous book. I already killed him off. So, but and Jared gets caught up in wanting vengeance and hires on as a vigilante, and he leaves his family in kind of dire need and turns out in some dangerous situations because he's so consumed with this vengeance that he's seeking, and his wife Eleanor understands that, and but oftentimes you see this, that as good old American males, our go-to emotion is anger, and so we're, by God, we're mad and we're going to go kill somebody. And women have the good sense to go through sadness and process their grief and decide what to do next, and they're much more healthy about the way they do it. And that's her approach. And so at the end of the book, they are at really just at odds, and she tells him to go away for now, and it just begs the question, what's going to happen to their relationship? And I guess the short answer to your question is I do intend to resolve that issue in the next book, in the next Moon book. If you want to know how I'm going to resolve it, I couldn't tell you, because I don't know yet. I really don't know. One of the things when you write a series, I think you get to know the characters, and they almost take on a life of their own, not in the Stephen Kingish sense, but they sort of do things based on their histories that you created for them. And so, but with this one, these are really strong-willed, intelligent people who are at odds in terms of how they saw this life-threatening situation. They also love each other dearly, and so I don't know. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think it'll be resolved one way or the other. So
how hard was it to not fully resolve the ending in the book?
Well, there's there's two parts to that. I think one is it's just sometimes it's a nice little cliffhanger thing to keep people interested, and I'm shameless enough that I don't mind resorting to that. But the other thing about it was, because truly, I felt like I was at the end of this particular chapter or phase of their story, and to me, it wasn't resolved. I mean, there was no way to realistically resolve the question of whether they would be back together or not without it just seeming kind of like tying a bow on something and try to make it pretty just so everybody says, oh, good, well, we got that taken care of. It didn't seem true to the characters. It didn't seem true to, it's a fictional reality, but I'd like it to be as realistic as it can be. And so I just couldn't see that I could just say, okay, well, everything's going to be okay, because I didn't think so. And it's going to take a lot more for everything to be okay. So it didn't turn out to be too difficult for me to just leave it kind of hanging.
Was just a few months short of after our Billings convention, my dad actually went with me, and he was killed in a tragic farm accident then. And you can see with this, Delaney's lost somebody important to him that he looked up to, and you see that loss play out in the book. Do you care to talk about that, or was any of that personal with you? Were you writing from something you personally experienced, or how'd that all come about?
Well, it wasn't super personal. I mean, like everybody, I've lost people, and so I kind of have an idea what that's like. The thing that it was really more related to the whole series and the story in the very first book, Rustler's Moon, where you're introduced to the character Jared Delaney. His backstory is that when he was, I think it was 10 years old, if I remember correctly, his parents were killed by renegades, outlaws. They came in, and his mother made him hide, and so he was hiding, and his parents were killed. So he lost his parents, which was obviously traumatic, and he developed what today we would call PTSD, but nobody knew what that was at that time. And so he had issues about trust, about unresolved feelings about losing his parents, anger at the people that killed his parents, and his powerlessness to deal with them. And so over the course of the next 3 books in that series, essentially you see the people in his life, which included Sheriff Nathan Averill, who was the person who was killed leading into this book, Halo Moon, who became a father figure to Jared Delaney, and as well as to his wife Eleanor for other reasons that are complicated. But So when he was murdered, it just really dredged up all of those feelings, and Jared started. He had classic PTSD symptoms. He had nightmares and things like that. He was kind of prone to rage, totally irrational anger reactions to things, and so it's not so much based on personal experience in terms of my own personal life, but it is based on working as a therapist for many, many years. I worked with a lot of people with PTSD, and so I've seen up close, how people deal with things, and so that's where a lot of that came from.
Uh, I noticed in the reading the book Halo Moon, there aren't any real shrinking violets among the women in that book. How do you go about writing women characters like those who people this book? Ones are both strong and resolute. How do you go about that?
Well, I've been really fortunate in my life to just know a lot of strong women. Role models more specific to Western women. I know any number of women who are authors, who are in many cases they're ranch women. If I ever got backed in a corner and was about to get in a fight, there's some women I'd rather have with me than some of the guys I know. Deanna McCall is a great example. She's one of my best friends, and she's just strong and tough, and she can be very gentle and polite, but man, you're gonna know where she stands, and if you have any questions, she'll straighten you out. And many other people. So there's that experience. Some of it goes back to my own mother, who it's funny because I was born and grew up in a time when many women were homemakers, and so most maybe all of my friends' moms were stay-at-home moms. And my mother had a degree in journalism. She worked for the Beaumont Journal newspaper in Beaumont, Texas, and she wasn't a society reporter. She was a city hall reporter. I mean, she knew the mayor and the city council, and she was a news reporter, and that's what I grew up with. My sister is brilliant and very strong, and used to beat me up till I don't know, probably mid-teens, I guess. I don't know. It took a while. She finally quit beating me up, but so I just known a lot of strong women, and one of the things that I did, by the way, so something I don't like is when we try to rewrite history and make it like we want it to have been rather than the way it was. And I saw that danger in this, that there were different kind of boundaries and definitions for what men and women did in those times. And I think it's easy to stereotype that the way some kind of more traditional Western novelists do, where the woman is kind of weak and passive, and oh, she's the damsel in distress, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted them to be strong and resolute, uh, but at the same time, there were issues they had to deal with about what they could and couldn't do and what was acceptable. And so I tried to kind of walk that line, and I did. I mean, Deanna McCall's an example, and well, Karen Casey Fitzgerald and Carol Markstrom, a number of my female author friends, I asked them to read the book. Ashley Sweeney read the book too, and I wanted their feedback about, was I getting it the way it should be? Was I missing something? And so that's a lot of how I tried to put that together, is just my own experience with various women that I've known over the course of my life, but also getting that input and feedback from female authors.
You wrote a character in this book called Davy Good,
I'm glad
and
you brought him up.
he's kind of an interesting character. He kind of walks both sides of the law, and he's had experience kind of on both sides of it. What inspired that guy?
So I have to back up and say, in the second book of my series, it's called Colorado Moon. Jared Delaney, who had a traumatic event when he lost his parents, and by the time we get to the second novel, he's come a long way because he has this loving environment of friends and family that kind of help him through it. Uh, so when he goes on a cattle drive and he has these two young cowboys who are like 16 years old that he hires, and one of them had a similar experience, and his name is Tommy Stallings. And so there's a kind of a side plot in that book where Tommy is exhibiting a lot of the kind of obnoxious behaviors that Jared had exhibited, and Jared's kind of on the other side of that issue, trying to help him come to terms with it. And to me, I felt like it was good, just good part of the story. And so in the third book, so what evolved in the third book is this character Tommy Stallings got a much bigger role in my third book, Waning Moon, and he was sort of the moral compass and the voice of what was right and what was wrong. And you can tiptoe around it, and obviously there's shades of gray, but sometimes it just comes down to that ain't right, and you shouldn't get away with that. And so he was the character that said that. And he sort of earned his own series, because there's two books now, The Big Empty and Lights of Cimarrón, that he is the central character in. So I liked kind of that idea of having I guess it's a foil, I don't know what the correct term would be necessarily, but so I created this character, Davy Good, he's a teenager. And just briefly, his backstory is that his father was an outlaw, and his older brothers were outlaws, and Dad brought him into the business. And Davy didn't. It was kind of like his mother. He didn't want to be an outlaw, and he didn't want to kill people, and he didn't want to rob banks, even though he did get sucked into that stuff. Uh, and so he makes a run for it, gets away at some point, and then he runs into Jared Delaney, and so mostly his role in this whole thing is as Jared gets more radical and fanatical about getting vengeance on this really bad guy. Davy's saying, so tell me again, how are you different from this guy you're going after? Where's the line that when you cross it, you're just as bad as the bad guy? And so that was the purpose of Davy. And then I thought I came up with a kind of a fun little twist at the end to kind of launch Davy. And I don't know, maybe Davy may get his own series. I don't know. Depends on how hard I want to work in the next few years. But that was kind of where he came from, is that he was saying things that needed to be said, and that other people were saying that Jared wouldn't listen to. So he was a new voice and a different voice, and maybe in a lot of ways more objective, because he didn't have a relationship with Jared. He was saying some of those same things, and as caught up as Jared was in this whole quest for vengeance, he's still a decent person, and he's still an intelligent man, and he was able to use all that to kind of stop himself and say, well, wait a minute. I just occurred to me, and I don't think I thought about this, but it was almost like Davy was his therapist, except of course we didn't have therapists back then either. But
I noticed on this book, Halo Moon, and also the one I'd read previously, it seems like your main characters, like Tommy Stallings, Jared Delaney, they seem like they're rather travelers, even though they have home lives and whatever. And I kind of had a theory that maybe that appealed to you, being that you're a singer songwriter and you do a lot of traveling. I wondered if that your other career has any impact on your writing, or such as that.
Well, and probably in a lot of ways. It's funny, when you said that, I hadn't really thought about the connection between those two characters and me in that way, but that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm absolutely not into horoscopes and things like that, but I am a Taurus, and Taurus is typically, you would describe them as homebodies, and and so I'm a very much a homebody. I love being at home, but I also love traveling. And so it's almost kind of like a tension constantly. It's like I can't wait to get out on the road and be gone for a while, and then I can't wait to get home. And that's kind of how those guys are. So that in that respect, definitely being a musician and kind of a wandering minstrel um, has had an impact on the development of those characters. Even I think the other thing about being a songwriter, one of the things you have to do, I mean, you got about 400 words in 3 to 5 minutes to tell a story. And so you got to kind of put it together in your head, and you got to know where you're going, and then you fill in the details and provide color. And in songwriting, I mean, you do that with the music, and you do it with using words that paint images in people's minds so that they don't have to read a long description like you would be able to do in a book. But it's the same thing. I want, like all of us who write novels, I would dearly love to have my books made into, like a streaming series or something like that. But one of the things that happens with that, and I know this from my own experience, is somebody makes a series. There's a Reacher series, Jack Reacher, and I love books. And I was really worried when I watched that because I know what Reacher looks like. And I know how he was described, and I know in my head what he looks like. And they made a movie of that with, I won't mention his name, but it was Tom Cruise. And Tom Cruise was not Jack Reacher. I mean, he's about a foot shorter than Jack Reacher. And so when you read a book, or when I read a book, I see those people. I mean, I know who they are, I know what they look like. And so you're kind of used to doing that as a songwriter of using words that evoke an image in somebody's mind, a picture. So I think that probably affects my novel writing. One thing I end up doing a lot of, because in a song you only have 400 words, you can labor over every single word. When you're writing 80,000 words, that's a monumental task, and yet there's a lot of that does go on, and I can bless her heart, Hazel Rumney, the editor for Five Star. She has been so helpful to me over the years about the words that I use, the way I depict things. I mean, she's just helped me sharpen all that. Luckily, she's really a nice person because she just kicks my tail and makes me change things. And I'm like, oh God, she didn't like it. But every single time it's made it better. And I think that's also from being a songwriter, you kind of used to that with you working with people that you respect. You give each other that feedback and you don't pull any punches. And, so that's a long answer to your question, but yeah.
Now earlier we were talking about strong, resolute women. And so this question sort of came from my wife when we were watching your last, your last concert. You played Halo Moon, and she asked this question kind of at the end of it, and I thought it was perfect to ask today. Which came first, the book or the song?
Well, in the very beginning, the song Rustler's Moon came first, and I wrote that song, and people really seemed to like it. To this day, I play it, and people really get into it. And so at some point, it occurred to me that it was a good story, and that maybe there was room to expand it. And I literally remember very clearly having this thought: well, I've never written a book. How hard could it be? And of course, you and I and everybody else knows how hard it can be. And but I didn't know it at the time, which is why I was dumb enough to just start doing it. So the song came first there. In my subsequent books, Colorado Moon, Waning Moon, and The Big Empty, I wrote the books, and then I wrote a song for the book. In the book Lights of Cimarrón, I actually had a song, The Lights of Cimarrón, which it's in many ways it really makes a good companion to that book, but I didn't design the book after the song or anything like that. And then the book Halo Moon, that was kind of interesting and a little bit weird, I guess, because the beginning sequence in the book Halo Moon is a dream sequence because Jared does have nightmares, and there's some kind of spooky images that he's dealing with in the very beginning, and it led me to write kind of a spooky song, kind of a ghost story song, and I utilized the Halo Moon, which is the title of the book. I really researched that about what that is, and it's a moon that has a misty halo around it, And meteorologists will just tell you that probably that means there's a change coming in the weather, and that you might expect bad weather. And then the kind of the old wives' tale is there's a change coming and it ain't good. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a neat, image to use to say something's happening and we don't know what it is, but it feels threatening, and then you don't pay attention, and then too late you find out you should have paid attention. So that's where that. So most of the time, the songs come after I've written the books, but the very first one was the book came from the song.
Jim, that kind of leads us to sorry, Bob. I was gonna say this kind of leads us to some questions that we have from audience members. I'm gonna try to get to those here. First of all, people are saying such a great conversation, really enjoying it. Looking forward to reading both books. Great conversation. Bob, you probably work at least 40 hours a week. And Jim, you're a hardworking traveling musician, always on the road. When do you find the time to write these great books? And we have just a few minutes left to answer these questions. So what do you say to that? Bob, do you want to start, or Jim?
No, Bob.
Well, I don't think I find the time. I try to make the time. It's increasingly difficult all the time, and I think that's probably what's inspiring me to try to retire here in about 15 months. But it is difficult. I work a 12-hour shift. I drive one way each way, so I got a 14-hour day ahead of me every day I'm working, and it's difficult. But I try to work it in between. I actually had one job there for a while where I could, in between jobs, I could do a little writing, which helped back then a lot. But I'm getting the point now where it's pretty difficult to get to, and I struggle at it, and I try to stay with it. But it's a challenge. If I had a magic bullet to take care of it, I'd share it with everybody. I don't know I have one.
Well, yeah, that's a really good answer. And I mean, really until not quite 10 years ago, I was working full time in a job, and then I was working pretty much full time as a musician, and then I started writing books. And so you have to grab the time when you can. Since I left that other field that I was in, and I focused full time on music and writing books. When I'm not traveling, I try to structure my days and my time. Like for me, working on a novel works best for me in the morning because I'm freshest and feel the most creative. And then in the afternoon, I can write a song, or I can rehearse or whatever. But somehow it works better in the evening. But I think one of the things. Probably the answer, and it's not much of an answer, is if you determine to do it, you'll find time. I know my friend Jim Wilson, who Bob knows also, used to do author talks with Elmer Kelton at schools, and they would go. But he said Elmer told him one time, he said, this is a little bit of a waste of time, because he said if a kid wants to write, if a kid doesn't want to write, you can't make them, and if they do want to write, you can't stop them. And I think that maybe that's the answer.
That's a good line. Janice Herf, who is an author herself, she says, great conversation. We'll make a point of reading these books in real life. We can't control what happens, but all authors, I think we write because we can control the outcomes. And I love that. That's her humble opinion, she wrote.
Yep.
And Mark Jackson's on with us tonight. Great to have you on. And Deborah Swenson, she's thoroughly enjoying the conversation, and both books will be on her TBR list. Wonderful. And I just want to thank Bob and Jim for joining us this evening. I also want to thank our technical director, Barrett Rezak. He's amazing. He's the one that can figure all this out so we could live stream. And Jim and Bob's books are available where all fine books are sold. And we always encourage purchase your books from your local independent bookstore. Both of their books are available in every independent bookstore across the country through their distribution markets. And I want to invite you to join us for our November talk, and that will be November 29th at same time, same place, the Blue Cottage Agency, 7:00 Central Standard Time. And we're going to be hosting Frank Weber and Martha Burns, and they will be discussing their true crime novels. And also, thanks for subscribing to the Blue Cottage Agency YouTube channel. And with that, I will say good evening and thank you again, Jim Jones and RG Yoho. It is always a pleasure. I'm just always in awe of the time and the passion and the writing that you guys have in creating these works for us to enjoy. So thank you for that. And have a good evening. Thank you.